Jessica Taylor was once a living, breathing person, with dreams and goals that she desired to bring to life. Much like the 4 victims of the Long Island serial killer, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello, Jessica Taylor was brought into the world of prostitution. It was an easy way to make quick money, but it brought with it a life full of pitfalls. Jessica soon discovered those hazards. She had grown up in New York, where she spent the better part of her early adulthood. It was there that she began to work as a prostitute, and where she had served a small stint at Rikers Island. Shortly after her prison stint, she relocated to Washington, D.C. There, she got arrested again, and was charged with prostitution for the second time. To avoid her charge, she moved back to New York, where she would face 2 more charges of prostitution. One there, and then another in Atlantic City. She also began to dabble in drugs, which sent her desperately scrambling to the profession to support her habit. Her life was like so many we've seen or heard of before, a tragedy. Unfortunately, few tragedies have a happy ending, and the life of Jessica Taylor was no exception. Jessica had tried to avoid her prostitution charges in Washington, D.C. by traveling to New York City for work. In February of 2003, Jessica was arrested by an undercover police officer, whom she had solicited for a sum of $50. She had just gotten in trouble for driving a stolen car, a 1995 Chevy Cavalier, and was sent to Rikers Island for a couple of months. During her arrest, she was noted as assaulting a police aide. Despite that assault charge being added to her grand theft auto and prostitution charges, she was released in April of 2003, less than 2 months after entering prison. She immediately went back to work, and tried to avoid Washington, D.C., where she had more charges pending. Jessica was trying to solicit clients off of New York's 10th Avenue, nearby the Port Authority bus terminal, in July of 2003 when she was last seen alive. When people disappear, it is often months or years before their fate is truly known. Sadly, though, Jessica's fate was known just weeks later. On July 26, 2003, a woman was walking her dog in Manorville, New York, just off of the Long Island Expressway. The road itself, Halsey Manor Road, was a small 2-lane road that led from the expressway to more rural areas of Manorville. It was during this walk that she discovered the headless, limbless torso of a young woman. A woman that would later be confirmed to be Jessica Taylor. A Washington, D.C. police officer, who was personally familiar with Jessica, stumbled upon crime scene photos of her torso, where the killer, or killers, had tried to scrape or otherwise mutilate her most recognizable mark, a tattoo of wings on her torso, which contained the words, "Remy's Angels." Whoever had killed and dumped Jessica Taylor's body had tried to keep her identity anonymous, but had failed. Unfortunately, the rest of their work, hiding her head and some of her limbs, would not be uncovered for almost a decade, when the Suffolk County police would unearth the rest of her body along with other bodies in 2011. There, the link would be established, and increase the likelihood that the Long Island serial killer had been active long before anyone knew he even existed. And it raised the idea that this dumping ground was just one of many, perhaps making him one of the most nefarious serial killers in United States history. Welcome to the Unresolved podcast. I'm your host, Micheal Whelan, and this episode is part 3 of my look at the Long Island serial killer, which began 2 episodes ago with the story of Shannan Gilbert's disappearance and the discovery of the original bodies. Last episode, I told you about the 4 women originally found, and the lives that led to them becoming victims of the Long Island serial killer. All 4 were found in burlap sacks, being left in the muck of Gilgo Beach as if they were just a bother to the killer, or killers. I highly recommend that you go back and listen to those first 2 episodes if you haven't already. This episode will pick up immediately after the discovery of those bodies, and include a lot of details that take us to the grisly, unsatisfying conclusion of the story, so far. So now, without any further ado, we travel back to Gilgo Beach one final time, where detectives have just discovered the identity of the 4 bodies. Richard Dormer was a man with one foot out of the door. His job, acting as police commissioner for Suffolk County, was likely coming to an end. Steve Levy, the county executive who appointed Dormer to his office, was on his way out. He had attempted to run for New York governor, but flip-flopped parties at a very inopportune time, and now found himself stuck between both without any real support. Instead of risking being voted out of office, while also being investigated for misusing campaign funds, Levy was going to avoid running for re-election altogether. So Dormer, an Irish immigrant as a child who had worked his way up the Suffolk County police force, was the odd man out. Any county executive that took over was likely to replace most of the appointed positions, police commissioner included. This last year, his final year as police commissioner, was supposed to be a quiet one. Instead, the remains of 4 women had been uncovered while searching for another, all 5 being women that had advertised their services on Craigslist. The bodies were discovered in December of 2010, roughly 7 months after the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert. The bodies were sent off for DNA testing to confirm their identities, but the early word was that they were all females, and all prostitutes. Megan Waterman, the missing 22-year-old mother from Portland, Maine who had last been seen just 20 or so minutes north, was immediately rumored to be one of the skeletons discovered in Burlap. When DNA testing confirmed their identities, in January of 2011, Richard Dormer held a press conference to release the details to the public. There, he also told of his theory of who had murdered the 4 women, a serial killer who had been using Gilgo Beach as his own personal dumping ground. Unsurprisingly, the news that a serial killer had been targeting young women sent shockwaves throughout the worldwide media. The major news networks were there to report the news that Dormer had told them, and every news agency had stories about the bodies that were discovered. But, surprisingly, not everyone in Suffolk County wanted Commissioner Dormer to be as candid about his theories to the media. Steve Levy, the county executive who appointed Dormer to his position, came down on Dormer for revealing too much information with the public. Levy, you see, was facing scrutiny for campaign funding in his unsuccessful bid for the governor's office, and he didn't want the cloud of a serial killer hanging over his final months in office. And Levy wasn't alone. District Attorney Thomas Spoda hesitated to look after this as the crime of a serial killer. Spoda, the prosecutor who had led the pursuit of Steve Levy's fundraising investigation, refused to name the killings the work of a serial killer until the DNA testing came back. The results, though, were too conclusive to pass up. All young women in their 20s who had disappeared over the prior 3 to 4 years after advertising their services on Craigslist. For now, as police continued to comb through the area of Gilgo Beach for more bodies, investigators had to begin looking for clues. The bodies of the 4 women were too decomposed to find much forensic evidence. Any DNA that might have been recovered from their bodies had long since deteriorated, and would undoubtedly come back as being inconclusive, the harsh environment of salt water and wind eating away at any chance of that. Instead, police began to examine the details of their disappearances. All 4 women, Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber, went missing between the months of June and September. This led to the first possibility, that the killer was a vacationer who was familiar with the area. Police began to run off of this, going down their list of locals who should be suspected. They made a pass at Joseph Brewer again, the client Shannan Gilbert had met on the night of her disappearance, and this is when he took his alleged successful polygraph test. Police again cleared him of any wrongdoing, along with Shannan's driver Michael Pack and the less than forthcoming neighbor Dr. Peter Hackett. Another clue, or calling card of the killer, was how he managed to get the victims to drop their guard with him. One assumes that, since the 4 victims advertised their services on Craigslist, they were rather particular about their clientele. Many of the victims' families and friends recalled that they rarely did outcalls, only doing so for a special payday or a client that they were familiar with. Unfortunately for investigators, all 4 women anonymously left to meet up with their final client. Amber Costello, the most recent victim who had disappeared just months before her discovery, left the house she was living in without even bringing a cell phone or her purse. Megan Waterman, the victim who went missing just 3 months before Costello, left to meet with a client down a dark, abandoned service road. They were either desperate enough to do whatever this client asked of them, or comfortable enough with him to avoid their regular precautions. Or, perhaps sadly, a little bit of both. Another avenue the investigators wanted to travel down was to figure out the killer's identity by working backwards through the victim's cell phones and emails. They had already become aware of the cell phones of both Maureen Brainerd Barnes and Melissa Bartholomew being used after their disappearances. Maureen's had been turned on somewhere close to Fire Island, where it pinged off of a tower there, about a month after her disappearance. Melissa's phone, meanwhile, had been used to call and taunt her younger sister, Amanda. Because the taunting phone calls contained personal information about Amanda, such as physical details of her and her sister, police figured that whomever took Melissa had likely been in her life for a while. Amanda would constantly make trips to visit her older sister, and police figured that the killer must have been associated with Melissa in some way before her death, perhaps as a regular client or a stalker of some kind. But besides the cell phone avenue, police wanted to use the victim's emails against the killer. Unfortunately, what they found were a list of throwaway email addresses that led nowhere. The Craigslist email system notoriously uses an anonymous email system, which clouds most email addresses. Other than that, anyone with access to a simple VPN, a virtual private network, can cloud their IP from almost anywhere. If the police wanted to find a suspect, they needed to find more evidence. They continued to search the area until the weather ground them to a halt. In January and February, they were forced to postpone any future searches of the area, at least until the weather picked up again. When the searches picked up again in March, they were shocked to immediately find something.
Yesterday, members of the police department, the Homicide Canine, Marine Bureau, Aviation Bureau, resumed the search for missing person Shannan Gilbert, who's been missing since May 1st of last year. And the search was conducted from Oak Beach to Cedar Beach to Gilgo Beach, that area along Ocean Parkway in Babylon. As part of that search, remains that we now know to be human remains were located by an officer from the Marine Bureau off Ocean Parkway west of Cedar Beach. The area is approximately 1 mile east of where the human remains were previously located in December of last year. Homicide Squad detectives and personnel from the Suffolk County Crime Lab, the County Police ID Section, and the Office of the Suffolk County Medical Examiner responded for investigation. The remains were taken to the Office of the Suffolk County Medical Examiner in Hauppauge, where an investigation will be conducted to identify the remains.
This body, the fifth to be discovered, was found just about 30 feet in from the road, and about a mile east of where the remains of the original 4 victims had been discovered. These remains were discovered by a police officer who had seen something suspicious and investigated further, but had no idea that he was unearthing a mystery a decade in the making. These remains were later proven to be that of Jessica Taylor, the prostitute from the introduction who had disappeared in July of 2003. Her headless, armless torso had been discovered north of Gilgo Beach, off an abandoned road in Manorville, just a few weeks after her disappearance, but DNA would later prove these body parts were a match with that torso. It is very clear that whoever killed and dismembered Miss Taylor was very intent on preventing her identity from being discovered, even going to great lengths to remove a tattoo from her body, said District Attorney Thomas Spoda.
The search in the Oak Beach, Cedar Beach, Gilgo Beach area is continuing. We're going to have an extensive search of that area again. Commencing Monday, we'll have many officers and units out in that area. Homicide Squad detectives are continuing the investigation of these remains, as well as the investigation of the deaths of the 4 women that were found off Ocean Parkway in December of 2010.
From Fox 5 News, this is Good Day New York.
Well, the remains of 3 more bodies found at Gilgo Beach on Long Island. Joining us this morning is forensic psychologist Dr. J. Buzz von Ornsteiner. Thank you so much, Dr. Buzz, for being here. They're not saying it's a serial killer yet, but it sure looks like that to the average layperson.
Yes.
What kind of psychology, what do you think is going through this guy's mind right now?
A number of things. I used to work in the prison system at New York State, but we work with people who have personality disorders, and people with personality disorders, people oftentimes look at them as sociopaths. sociopaths. It's really an antisocial personality trait. They have no empathy. They have impulsive needs. They have primitive needs. This could be a thrill killer. This could be someone who's engaging in sex attacks, seeking revenge. On the flip side, it could be someone who's suffering from delusions and hallucinations, like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam. He thought he was hearing voices. He thought a dog was talking to him, and he felt compelled to go out and kill individual innocent people.
But if it's the work of the same person to keep going back to the same spot, dumping bodies over there, does this person want to get caught?
Well, see, I don't go with that theory. I believe this person is a very organized killer, and for whatever reason, he has sought out prostitutes. Why did he search out prostitutes? Why is he murdering prostitutes? Why is he murdering women that are petite inside? Maybe it's all about power and control. Maybe it's about revenge. Maybe he feels he's driven to rid the world of prostitutes, but he's seeking them out in an organized manner, and then he's dumping them, some of them, it seems, in burlap bags, kind of disorganized in a dumping ground out on Long Island. There's a lot of clues there. Sometimes people have compulsions to do this, and then once they have been satiated or once they have murdered, there is a cooling off period, but this has gone on for years. My fear is that he'll continue to kill unless someone comes forward or someone has seen something.
The search immediately continued the following week to try and find more bodies or evidence of their supposed serial killer. Already, investigators were becoming overwhelmed. The story had gone from a missing prostitute to a full-blown serial killer seemingly overnight, and now police weren't sure just how many bodies there were or how far back they dated. This was now in April of 2011, close to 5 months after the 4 bodies had been discovered in burlap. Just 5 days after they found the rest of Jessica Taylor's body, they would uncover the bodies of 3 more victims, all of whom pointed to a very grisly portrait of this killer. The first was a woman, known by investigators as Jane Doe No. 6, whose head, arms, and right foot were discovered along the Ocean Parkway. DNA testing would confirm that this woman matched remains found in Manorville on November 19, 2000, nearby where Jessica Taylor's torso had also been dropped. Police now had more than one case linking these bodies to discarded victims in Manorville. Police have released a composite of this victim, whom they assume stood about 5 feet and 2 inches tall, and was somewhere in the age range between 18 and 35. She was most likely a prostitute, like the other victims. The second body discovered on April 4th belonged, most unusually, to a man of Asian descent. Apparently, this body had been discovered wearing women's clothing, leading investigators to believe that this was a trans woman who had been working as a prostitute, unbeknownst to the killer. Police believe that this young man, who I stated was of Asian descent, had likely died from blunt force trauma, which they derived from teeth missing from the skull. He was smaller in stature, standing only about 5 foot 6 inches tall, and was most likely between the age of 17 and 23. This victim had been dead somewhere between 5 and 10 years, according to investigators, who were puzzled at the lack of missing persons reports to link this victim to. Sadly, there was one other victim discovered on April 4th, and this one was the most heartbreaking of all. This victim was just an infant, a little girl somewhere between 18 and 32 months old. Police immediately began to assume that this was the child of a prostitute that they had yet to discover, a child that had just so happened to be with her mother on the night the killer decided to act. This young victim, known as Baby Doe to the investigators, was found wrapped up in a blanket, wearing 2 unique items of jewelry, hoop earrings and a rope necklace. This child, the youngest of the victims by far, showed no signs of trauma, implying that her death had not been a violent one. Unfortunately, police were not done discovering bodies. A week after this grisly discovery, police made yet another startling find: the remains of 2 more bodies. These body parts would further link the Ocean Parkway dumping grounds to the Manorville dumping grounds from years prior, but also begin to splinter the investigation. The first body was that of a woman whose skeletal remains were wearing the same type of jewelry as Baby Doe. They were 2 bracelets, one with X and O charms and the other with stones made to look like diamonds. DNA testing would confirm that this woman had been related to the unidentified Baby Doe, and had likely been her mother. Surprisingly though, her skeleton was found inside a plastic bag placed over 7 miles away, as she was discovered just near Jones Beach State Park. The other body discovered on this day was the most shocking of all. Found near Tobay Beach, a few miles to the west of Gilgo Beach, was the skull of yet another woman. They also found a few of her teeth in the surrounding area, but DNA testing would show that this woman was the same victim from 1996, whose leg had washed up to shore in a plastic bag on Fire Island, miles away. This would raise the biggest question of all. Was there one serial killer that had been preying on prostitutes for nearly 20 years?
Right now, based on, the common denominators, the similarities of the victims, where they were dumped, the dismemberment, it looks like one person. And the fact that Manorville remains that were found in 2000 and 2003 are now connected to remains found years later off Ocean Parkway. And the two legs found off Davis Park in '96, which is 15 years ago, connected to remains found off Ocean Parkway. Again, that leads to the theory that it's one person using this area as a dumping ground and dismembering the bodies so that the police could not identify them if they were found. When the Asian male was found, that was unusual. We thought that was, out of the ordinary, a male with all the females. But then he was wearing women's clothes. He was of slight build, possibly involved in the sex trade. That's the theory. Then the toddler, of course, was another issue that didn't fit the pattern. But the toddler, through DNA later, was connected to a female remains found 7 miles away, across the line into Nassau County. Is she involved in the sex business? Maybe. We're assuming that she was. And people in the business and people that have, are very familiar with the prostitution business tell us that, a sex worker will bring a youngster with them sometimes when they meet a client. This case is not cold. I don't like that term because it indicates that we've given up on it and that it's put in a file drawer someplace. Not true. The detectives in our forensics unit and the Homicide Squad are still working diligently on leads that we received after the last press conference. We do know that this person is organized, is methodical in what they do, rather than a disorganized killer. But again, there's all sorts of theories about what kind of person this killer is. And I tell people all the time that when we do catch the person, everybody will be surprised.
Richard Dormer, the lame duck Suffolk County Police Commissioner, obviously clung to the idea that this was a single killer. However, Thomas Spoda, the reigning district attorney, thought otherwise. Spoda began circulating the idea that, due to the differences in time periods and disposal methods of the multiple bodies discovered, that there were multiple killers that had been using this stretch of Ocean Parkway as a dumping ground. This wasn't odd because there were obvious differences in the bodies discovered. The older bodies that had been discovered were unidentified but dated back to 1996. There was a possibility that the 4 identified victims who had been found in burlap were connected, but they were connected solely by the location and their probable employments. This also doesn't mention, of course, how the victims connected to Manorville would open up the investigation to so many other unidentified victims, whose bodies had been found in the years and months prior to when the investigation began. But this simple argument would begin to fracture the investigation as a whole. Certain detectives would cling to the single killer theory, while others would follow Spoda and begin to pursue the multiple killer theory. Despite this growing fraction between different sides of the investigation, everyone involved would agree that this wouldn't have a simple solution.
The public, including the media, should realize that this investigation is not an episode of CSI or Criminal Minds that is going to be solved in a 1-hour period. The investigation is multifaceted, multi-jurisdictional, and most likely is going to take a very long period of time to complete.
During this April search for more bodies, police had started to use new and innovative ways to search the terrain. They had begun using helicopters overhead to find places of interest to have officers look later. They would mark these on an interactive map as places of interest, going on to pinpoint over 90 spots on the surrounding area to send searchers to. Speaking of searchers, hundreds of officers from Suffolk County and the surrounding areas were sent to participate in the search. Unfortunately, the rough bramble kept the search from progressing quickly, meaning that police needed to find new ways to look. They would begin sending out large pieces of equipment to trim and cut the bramble as they progressed, as it was too rough for searchers to walk without hurting or injuring themselves. They would take vehicles like fire trucks and extend the ladders sideways with officers on top looking down at the ground below to try and locate any signs of more bodies or clues. As it happened months earlier, the weather was beginning to get rough for investigators, and would require police to put their search on hold until the weather cleared up. Those 90 places of interest, quote-unquote, would have to wait months to be looked at. The investigation continued to split apart, with most belonging in Spoda's camp of multiple killers, but some others clinging to Dormer's single killer theory. But police now had a few things to work with. They had discovered that the earlier victims had been dismembered, their bodies cut up into pieces with identifying marks removed. Whomever the killer had been, he had tried to hide the features of the women involved. With the victims whose torso had been found in Manorville, he had removed the head and the hands in a way of keeping dental records and fingerprints from being utilized. He had also tried to scrape off identifying tattoos and definitive features. Also, when the victims had been dismembered, the killer had gone out of his way to split up the remains. Jessica Taylor and the other Manorville victim had had their body parts split up by a matter of 40 miles. In the case of the woman who had been killed along with her child, the killer had split up both bodies nearly 10 miles apart, even though the infant had been found within a short distance of other victims. However, to those that believed in the single killer theory, this was simply a sign of the killer becoming comfortable. It's possible that the killer, if he had been a local and familiar with the area, would know that the area off of Ocean Parkway would be a safe place to dump a body. Nobody would be traversing that area if they could help it, as the tough bramble would tear apart clothing and would be an issue for even the most ardent of explorers. Maybe after a time, when none of the bodies had been discovered for almost a decade, the killer began to get comfortable. He wouldn't have to split up the victims anymore, and he wouldn't have to make hour-long drives to dispose of the bodies. He could simply drop by one area, right off of the Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach, which would not only make an easy dumping ground for him, but provide anonymity while also allowing him to re-experience the thrill of his crimes over and over again. Noted author and former NYPD Lieutenant Commander Vernon Geberth came out in defense of Richard Dormer's single killer theory. "I wouldn't be so quick to be talking about multiple killers," said Geberth. "The probability of having two serial killers using the same dumping ground is very, very remote, to the point where I don't buy into it. I am looking at a serial killer who has basically progressed. He has become more effective at disposing of the bodies. He doesn't have to go through the work of decapitating his victims." Forensic psychologist N.G. Barrell, who had experience working for the NYPD, also agreed. "That coincidence, in and of itself, would be remarkable," said Barrell, addressing the multiple killer theory. To him, two killers sharing such a similar propensity of victims while also dumping the victims in the same area would have such a minute possibility of actually happening. The 1-year anniversary of Shannan Gilbert's disappearance was approaching, and with it, her mother Mary Gilbert continued to pester the police for any information. As I stated before, they had halted their search of the area due to the conditions being unsearchable, but Gilbert wanted her daughter to not go forgotten. Gilbert began to turn the intensity up, trying to use the media as a weapon. As journalists and documentarians began to focus on the burgeoning boogeyman of the Long Island serial killer, Gilbert tried to turn the focus back on her missing daughter, whose disappearance had jump-started the entire investigation. She began to make her qualms about Dr. Peter Hackett public knowledge, bombarding him at his home with a documentary crew in tow. She confronted him about the phone calls he had made to her on May 3rd of 2010, the day that Shannan had later been reported missing. He denied having any knowledge of Shannan or her disappearance, but that didn't stop Mary Gilbert. She started to make claims of Dr. Hackett providing prescription drugs for people in the neighborhood, aided by two neighbors who had multiple homeowners associations disputes with Hackett and testified to those accounts. Mary Gilbert also took question with Hackett's claim that he knew nothing of Shannan's disappearance. Gus Coletti, the retired insurance agent who opened up his door to Shannan on the night she disappeared, was often regarded as a close friend of Hackett's, who lived right next to him. What are the odds that in the days after Shannan disappeared, the two didn't talk at all about the most exciting story to hit the neighborhood in some time? At this point, it had not become common knowledge that Shannan had been on the phone with 911 when she went running from door to door. The press began to run wild when that was brought to light, with rumors that Shannan was screaming, "They're trying to kill me," and the Gilbert family began to push for the 911 call to be released to the public. However, to this day, over half a decade after Shannan disappeared, that call has not been released. Rumors persist to this day over why the call hasn't been released, but the most persistent of those is that she was bounced around from jurisdiction to jurisdiction throughout the entire 23-minute call. A few months after turning up the heat in the media, Mary Gilbert began pushing for the marsh behind Dr. Hackett's house to be dredged, thus allowing investigators time to fully search it. You see, Dr. Hackett lived right next door to Barbara Brennan, who owned the last house to receive a knock from Shannan on the night she disappeared. Dr. Hackett originally went against these wishes, not wanting the marsh to be drained, but consented after a month or so. When the search for bodies finally picked up again, and the police began hitting their noted 90 places of interest, the marsh would finally be drained, and Shannan Gilbert would finally be found. The search began again in earnest the first week of December of 2011, nearly a year after the first 4 bodies had been discovered. Police still had as much of an idea as to who the killer was as they did then, but were hoping to either find some more evidence that could clue them along, or to find more bodies and bring closure to missing person stories. On December 6th, they began searching one of their many places of interest, in the dredged marsh located behind Dr. Peter Hackett's house. It was on December 6th that police would finally discover some trace of Shannan. Up until that point, she had presumably just vanished into thin air, but on that morning, they discovered her purse and some belongings of hers, which included her cell phone and her pair of jeans. Officer John Malia, who had been the person to discover the bodies of the 4 victims in Burlap a year beforehand, was part of the search party that was searching throughout the area. A week later, on December 13th, the searchers would stumble upon a body, which was very identifiable due to the metal plate in the jaw.
Good morning, everybody. And today we have an announcement on the search for Shannan Gilbert. After an exhaustive, methodical, massive search, we have this day at approximately 9:14 a.m. located a set of skeletal remains we believe at this time to belong to the missing Shannan Gilbert. Of course, we will not know for sure if it's Shannan until the medical examiner confirms whether the remains belong to her. The cause of death, of course, is also unknown till the medical examiner does the examination and process of the remains. The body was found approximately 1/4 mile northeast of where her personal belongings were located last week. If it is Shannan Gilbert, then her location is indicative of her trying to make it to the causeway, which is northeast, the parkway, causeway and the parkway, northeast of where her remains were found. At that time of the morning, there would be lighting on the parkway, and it's possible that she could see the lights and was attempting to get there. The brambles and thick brush, the terrain, would have made it impossible for her to get to the parkway. Our people that were in there over the last few days had to cut through that brush and bramble area before she was located. The Homicide Squad, under the direction of Detective Lieutenant Polkowski, with members of DPW, were on an amphibious machine edging forward in the thick brush when the Homicide Squad detectives spotted the skeletal remains lying on the surface of the ground. I should mention that last week and yesterday, we drained areas adjacent to where the skeletal remains were found. We obviously are very glad that we found who we believe to be Shannan Gilbert. And by the way, I caution that has to be determined when the medical examiner does the examination. It's certainly a sad day for the Gilbert family, and our condolences to that family on the death of their daughter.
The same day that police discovered the body of Shannan Gilbert, the families of the other victims were holding a candlelight vigil. Mary Gilbert had been there on that day, and was guided by the police investigators to the back porch of Dr. Peter Hackett, which offered her the best view of the area where Shannan's body was discovered. She, however, was less than encouraged by how long it had taken police to find her missing daughter.
If they started the search early and continued it longer than they did the first time, we would have found her sooner, and this case would be so much farther ahead than it is. And I'm hoping and I'm praying that they use this as a training method to teach how to better their search methods when someone is missing and how they go about it. And as far as her 23-minute 911 call screaming for help, why it took them a total of 45 minutes to get here.
Police had to wait for the forensic examiners to fully look over Shannan Gilbert's remains and perform an autopsy to reveal a cause of death, but the early word was that she had died of the elements. When she had gone missing, word had gotten out that Shannan suffered from bipolar disorder. That, in conjecture with her drug use and alleged use of cocaine, led many to believe that she simply got zonked out of her mind and stumbled into an area that overwhelmed her. However, her body was discovered just a few hundred feet away from the Ocean Parkway. At the time of morning that she disappeared, she would have seen cars driving by and would have kept traveling towards the road if she was in a serious emergency. Also, it is worth noting that on the day she disappeared, the water level was low to the point of not being a threat. Experts agreed that on the day Shannan disappeared, the area that she had wandered into had a water level less than a foot deep. If she had drowned, it was highly probable that she had drowned in 6 to 8 inches of water. When her body had been discovered, she had also been found without her jeans and lying face up. What's most confusing about her discovery, however, is the absence of 2 hyoid bones in her throat. To many, this would imply that she had been strangled, but the Suffolk County medical examiners didn't think so. In May of 2012, 2 years after she had originally run through the neighborhood of Oak Beach, Shannan Gilbert's death was finally ruled as accidental. She was said to have died of misadventure, or otherwise via mishap. This is, however, after the medical examiners tested the exterior of her remains for any trace of cocaine, and found nothing. What's confusing about this ruling from the medical examiner's office is that it ignores some of the evidence, such as the missing hyoid bones in Shannan's throat, and only tested for cocaine on the surface of her skeleton. They could have tested Shannan's bone marrow for evidence of cocaine use, or other drugs for that matter, but for some reason decided not to. Despite all of the speculation regarding her cause of death, Shannan Gilbert still hasn't been officially tied to the investigation of the Long Island serial killer. Despite years of tribulations faced by her mother in trying to get her case looked at further, Shannan Gilbert's death is still ruled as accidental. In the latter part of 2012, investigators were still trying to gain any semblance of a lead in the case for the killer. Richard Dormer, the police commissioner, had been replaced by the newly elected county executive Steve Ballone's favored candidate, Edward Weber. By all indications, the new commissioner, Ed Weber, followed through with District Attorney Thomas Spoda's recommendation that there were multiple killers. The notion was, at the time, that there were at least 3 serial killers operating in the area and dumping the bodies of prostitutes within a 10-mile stretch of land. This is how police continued their investigation in the coming months, and unsurprisingly, no new evidence would come to light. In the fall of 2012, the investigation would face a new hurdle: Mother Nature herself. That October, Hurricane Sandy would strike the east coast of the United States, causing irrecoverable harm to the investigation and causing over $75 billion worth of total damage. It's impossible to know just how much of the investigation was forever changed by Hurricane Sandy. While I know it's not wise to argue what-ifs, one has to wonder just how much evidence was washed away by the insane winds and flooding, most of which impacted the New York and New Jersey area. After the setback of Hurricane Sandy, the future was not bright for Suffolk County investigators. They wouldn't find any more bodies the following year, in 2013, and all investigators could do was try and piece together what they knew. Rumors would begin to crop up that some of these rash of killings had been related to those in Atlantic City, where the bodies of 4 women, also prostitutes, had been discovered outside a hotel. This unknown killer, known as the Eastbound Strangler, had killed 4 women between October and November of 2006, and all 4 victims had been found fully clothed and facing east. One has to wonder if this would help fill in the gaps. Was this area of Long Island just one of his many dumping grounds? The link to remains discovered in Manorville points to yes. What's more is that one of the victims discovered in Atlantic City was Facebook friends with Amber Costello. That might be a bit of a stretch, but one has to wonder if there's a connection there in some small way. I'm sure the circles that prostitutes run in aren't huge, but at that time, in 2006, Facebook wasn't nearly as well known as it is now. It served as more of a networking tool. Dave Schaller, friends and roommates with Amber Costello, definitely thinks that her killer was someone that she knew. It's unclear why, but something made her trust him, recalled Schaller, who said his cell phone was used for one of their conversations and that he overheard parts of it. It was like she knew him. Police haven't officially connected any of the Long Island victims to the Atlantic City victims, but a possibility remains that there is a link between the two. A possible link between the Atlantic City and Long Island victims is a man known as John Bittrolff. John Bittrolff lived in the Manorville area of Long Island, where he was married, had 2 children, and worked as a carpenter. By all accounts, he was a regular guy who had lived in the community without issue for decades. In 2014, John's brother Timothy was arrested on charges of criminal contempt for violating an order of protection. Police, like always, take evidence from everyone arrested and check it in their DNA database. Surprisingly, the DNA pinged something. Not Timothy's DNA, but someone related to him. In the early 1990s, 2 women in the Manorville area had been brutally strangled, beaten, and left for dead in the woods. Their bodies had been posed in such a way that the bodies were quickly linked together, and their killer evaded justice for over 2 decades. That is, until Suffolk County police managed to get a hold of John Bittrolff's DNA, and it provided a clear match to those 2 cold cases. Ever since then, 2014, Bittrolff has been facing trial for those 2 murders. He has also been tied to a 3rd similar crime, which occurred in the same time period in November of 1993, but beyond that, no official link has been made to connect him to the victims found near Gilgo Beach. Many view him as a prime suspect in the case, due to his close proximity to the Manorville victims, which include Jessica Taylor. He lived just miles away from where those torsos were discovered, and many find it odd that he's linked to those 3 cold cases but none others. Many skeptics don't believe that a serial offender would strike 3 times over the period of 2 months, and then avoid killing altogether from then on. If we go back to the words of forensic psychologist N.G. Barrell, this is perhaps an instance of a killer who adapted. In the killings he's been charged with, Bittrolff did nothing to hide the bodies, and left crucial evidence behind. It's very possible that he continued to strike, adapting as he went along. It is also worth noting that one of Bittrolff's alleged victims, Rita Tangretti, had a daughter. That daughter had grown up to become best friends with Melissa Bartholomew, the first body discovered in Burlap. Police have theorized that the Long Island serial killer had stalked Melissa, due to the knowledge he had of her life and her sister. And even though police have supposedly cleared Bittrolff's name of any Long Island crimes, I find it hard to believe that this is all just coincidence. Other than Bittrolff, there have been no serious leads into other suspects. Many have suspected Akeem Cruz, also known as Vibe, the pimp and boyfriend of Megan Waterman. In the year after her disappearance, Cruz started serving a 20-month sentence for drug trafficking and other prostitution-related offenses, for working as a pimp. While he was in prison, Waterman's family pled with police to keep him there until she was located, and he was then sentenced to a 3-year sentence for violating the Mann Act, transporting Megan over state lines for prostitution. During his sentence, Cruz completely refused to cooperate with police, not telling them any details of the night Megan disappeared, and whether he was with her at any point during her last fatal client meetup. Others have tried to link convicted serial killer Joel Rifkin, who lived and operated in the Long Island area, to the crimes, but I just don't see it. The earliest victim linked to the Gilgo Beach dumping grounds was killed in 1996, 2 years after Rifkin began serving his life sentence. While it is possible that the killer is someone inspired by Rifkin, who also preyed upon prostitutes in the New York area, the idea of him being the killer is just preposterous to me. Many have also continued to suspect the men involved in Shannan Gilbert's final night, including her driver, Michael Pack, her client, Joseph Brewer, and Brewer's neighbor, Dr. Peter Hackett. Police have come out and definitively stated that none of these three have been persons of interest in Shannan's disappearance, let alone any of the murders. Both Brewer and Hackett have moved from the area, both claiming that their lives were ruined by the suspicious allegations that embroiled them and their families. Other than the very few suspects, we only have some leads that police have probably already followed up on. Investigators have looked at the possibility of a police officer being the killer, but came up with nothing. This was due to the fact that whomever contacted Amanda, Melissa Bartholomew's sister, seemed to have some knowledge of police tracking techniques. He knew to get off of the phone after a couple minutes, called from heavily populated areas full of tourists, and knew how to cover his tracks. Once the story broke, no other calls were made. Besides that connection, investigators uncovered that one of the vital people to be in contact with Maureen Brainerd Barnes was a Staten Island police officer, who was acting as a client and not a part of any police investigation into prostitution. Other than that lead, there's a strong likelihood that the killer, or killers, are decently skilled in certain technical skills. While it wouldn't require a technical genius for the killer to stay anonymous online, the fact that he managed to mask his IP address implies some knowledge of VPNs, online tools that allow users to mask their IP address with another. Again, these don't require a genius to use, but in the mid-2000s were much more difficult to obtain and less widely used. The possibility also exists that whoever killed the victims was a frequent drug user, someone who particularly used cocaine. Kim Overstreet, the sister of Amber Costello, has urged the police and media to continue investigating this lead, as almost all of the victims were drug users that could have provided the killer with his drug of choice. A much lesser sought-after clue was that of the burlap bags that Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, and Amber Costello's remains were found in. Many people online have theorized that whomever abducted and killed the four of them had access to burlap bags aplenty, at least to the point where transporting them wouldn't seem out of the ordinary. These online theorists have pointed to some of the nearby parks as being a potential place of employment for this person, perhaps as a park ranger, where walking through the bramble at any time of day or night and carrying burlap bags wouldn't seem too peculiar. One thing I haven't really spoken about throughout these 3 episodes is the relationship between Suffolk County and the FBI. Early on in the investigation, the FBI had offered its assistance. The FBI often helps to assist in any search for a serial killer, since so many killers cross state lines. Suffolk County, however, kept the FBI at arm's length. The FBI supplied a personality profile for the probable killer back in 2011, which detailed the likely psychological map of the killer's life. They surmised that he was somewhere between his late 20s and his mid-40s, that he was a white man who likely had a girlfriend or was married, that he was well educated and worked a stable job. It is possible that he had been to the hospital for poison ivy treatment, as he had undoubtedly came in contact with the vine during his many travels to the Gilgo Beach brush. The FBI profilers also pointed out the easy access to burlap sacks, or figured that he may have just bought a decent supply of them at one point. However, despite the FBI's insistence for future help, Suffolk County refused. The rationale was unknown at the time, but was exposed in 2014, when the long-serving police chief, James Burke, was arrested amidst a corruption scheme. It would turn out that Burke had long been taking advantage of his position as police chief to get away with being a criminal. He had frequented prostitutes in his youth, had allegedly dabbled in drug dealing and other minor crimes, and even confessed to driving drunk multiple times on the job. But he finally fell in hot water when he got so bold as to physically and verbally torture a prisoner who had stolen his SUV and unearthed a bag of sex toys. While this sounds like something out of a ridiculous cop show, I guarantee you that it's a true story. Burke would plead guilty just earlier this year in 2016, but the corruption scheme would go all the way up to District Attorney Thomas Spoda. Allegations have been made that paint Spoda in a very negative light and do nothing to repair his reputation as someone that damaged the integrity of this entire investigation. Apparently, James Burke, the police chief, wanted to avoid bringing in the FBI to completely avoid any of his own misdeeds from coming to light. So even though the largest crime-fighting organization in America offered to help find this sick killer, with the best criminal profilers and forensic analysts that money can employ, Burke decided to say no because he wanted to continue being a corrupt cop. Thankfully, Burke was eventually discovered and kicked out of office. He has since pled guilty to charges of corruption, among others, but Spoda, the district attorney who pushed the idea of multiple killers, now finds himself on the ropes and facing opposition from all sides, including the FBI. In December of 2015, the FBI announced that they were joining the investigation into the Long Island serial killer. It had been over 5 years since the original 4 bodies had been discovered, and with it, likely any chance of unearthing forensic evidence from the crime scenes themselves. But finally the investigation was being handed off to a higher power. One has to wonder just how much James Burke and Thomas Spoda damaged the integrity of the investigation for the simple sake of a man's greed. 2015 was a big year not only for the investigation of finding this unknown serial killer, but also for finding out the fate of Shannan Gilbert. Police had long since established their story. After meeting up with Joseph Brewer, Shannan had run off into the night in a drug-fueled frenzy, where she eventually fell into a bog and ultimately drowned. However, no drugs were found in her system, and her cause of death was ruled as being inconclusive. But again, medical examiners didn't do a scan of her bone marrow for any illicit narcotics for some unknown reason. Mary Gilbert, Shannan's mother, had long since argued the cause of Shannan's death as being unnatural. For years now, she had pointed some amount of blame at Dr. Peter Hackett for being involved in her death, and hired an attorney to file a suit claiming such. As part of this pending lawsuit, Mary Gilbert and her attorney, John Ray, acquired the services of Michael Baden, who was at one point the New York State Medical Examiner. He was a guy with an established professional record, whose opinion would be highly valued in any criminal investigation. Baden was brought in to perform a second autopsy of Shannan's body to try and find anything that might have been missed or ignored in her prior screening. In February of 2016, Gilbert's attorney, John Ray, made those autopsy results public, along with a statement written by Michael Baden himself. Baden wrote that Shannan Gilbert's death was most likely caused by strangulation due to the absence of her larynx and the missing hyoid bones from her throat. Baden ruled that these were undoubtedly signs of homicidal strangulation, words he wrote explicitly in his report. This went completely at odds with what the Suffolk County police had originally found in their own autopsy, and they had never investigated Shannan's disappearance or death as a potential homicide. Even after this report went viral and was submitted into the public record of Mary Gilbert's pending civil suit against Dr. Peter Hackett, police chose not to say whether or not they were opening up a homicide investigation for Shannan Gilbert. This was finally a huge score for the Gilbert family, but another tragedy was incoming. Just a handful of months later, in July of 2016, Mary Gilbert would be murdered by another of her daughters, Sarah. Over the years, it had been revealed to the Gilbert family that Sarah suffered from schizophrenia, leading to 10 hospitalizations as she tried to come to grips with the disease. Her mental disorder began to manifest itself in extreme ways weeks before this tragic occurrence, due in part to her going off of her medication, and going as far as killing the family dog in front of her 8-year-old son before this tragic outbreak. Needless to say, this was yet another terrible tragedy for the Gilbert family to have to face. I wish that I could end the podcast on some kind of high note, but unfortunately there's not much more story to tell. While investigators have long debated whether this is the tale of a single serial killer or multiple, the facts are still true. Nearly a dozen victims, mainly women but also one man, have been killed by an unknown, unidentified terror that has escaped justice for these crimes. In December of 2015, the bodies of 2 women were discovered in the woods outside of Brockton, Massachusetts. FBI profilers that looked at the case viewed the killer as someone who had killed before and would likely kill again. Both victims, one aged 50 years old and the other just 20, were prostitutes and both known to have issues with drugs. Sound familiar? In July of 2015, a prostitute working in Charleston, West Virginia was shocked when a client, an unassuming middle-aged man named Neal, turned violent on her. She battled for her life, eventually able to grab the man's gun, and shot and killed him. That man, now known as Neal Falls, was a potential serial killer who had a trunk full of devices and tools intended to kill and dispose of that prostitute's body, had she not fought back. Police have been working on retracing the footsteps of Neal Falls and think he may be responsible for the deaths of multiple women across the country. His potential victims most likely all worked as prostitutes and advertised their services online. Even if these final two stories have nothing to do with the story itself, they show a trend of these victims being targeted as nothing more than sport. Ever since Jack the Ripper rose to notoriety, the sadistic among us have viewed these victims as targets because of their place in society. They're poor, they're weak, and they're easily forgotten. We can only hope this changes because these are our sisters, our mothers, our daughters, our friends, and our neighbors. Given a different set of circumstances, they might be us. To this day, the identity of the Long Island serial killer remains unresolved. Well, everyone, there you have it. The story I've been obsessively researching and preparing for about a month now. The hardest part about doing this podcast is just the utter, unrelenting, depressing nature of it all. These are all stories that need to be told, and definitely deserve to be, but are just so morbid that it's hard to see the good side of humanity when I'm done. Anyhow, I'll step off my soapbox for now. Thanks for listening to these episodes of the Unresolved podcast, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to do so. I apologize for the long wait between the last episodes and this one. I took a bit of a break to relocate across the country. I'm now living on the humid East Coast, which has been a weird change, but I think I'm getting used to it. Slowly. Hope to get a lot more episodes done in the near future, and even though I may rant about the depressing nature of these stories, making the podcast is actually a lot of fun and something I enjoy doing. And now that I have a decent amount of time to commit to it, just gotta get past the aversion towards hearing my own voice. If you'd like to stay in touch with the podcast, you can find it on Twitter, Facebook, the works. I may not respond instantly, but I promise to respond to your comments and messages in due time. You could also donate to the podcast via PayPal or Patreon, which is now set up. A warning to all the Patreon listeners, I'm currently working on getting those perks set up and released, so please don't fret. I promise to get everything out that I've promised. I've just been working so hard on researching and recording that I haven't had much time to devote to the online portion of the podcast. So, I'm sorry, my apologies, I'll get it fixed. But anyhow, that's it for me. Hope you all are as ready as I am to kick off season 2 of the podcast, which I hope will be an incredibly productive one. Until next time, stay safe everyone.